like to announce our three speakers today, introduce our three speakers today. Many of them I think will be well known. Charles Grant, first of all, on the far side there, is the director of the Centre for European Reform, which he helped to found in 1996. He previously worked for The Economist, where he was posted to Brussels to cover the European community. He's been a director and trustee of the British Council and specialises broadly in EU and other foreign policy issues. And then our second speaker, who is sitting in the middle, is Professor Shinji Hyodo. He is the head of the America, Europe and Russia division at Japan's National Institute for Defence Studies. And Professor Hyodo is particularly a Russian specialist. He actually studied Russian at university before moving on to do an MA in international relations. He has worked in the political section at the Japanese embassy in Moscow in the past. He worked in the National Security Council for the Koizumi government a few years ago, and he's also been a visiting fellow of the Royal United Services Institute here in London. And then our third speaker, Dr. Bobo Lo, sitting next to me, is an independent analyst. He was previously director of the China and Russian programs at the Centre for European Reform, so he worked with Charles. And he was also head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, and has been deputy head of mission at the Australian embassy in Moscow. And he writes fairly extensively on Russian and Chinese foreign policy in particular. One recent thing you've written that intrigues me is Putin's pivot, why Russia is looking east, something you wrote earlier this year. So from a Japanese point of view, be interested to hear you flesh that out a little bit. And obviously today the main focus is power, the power of diplomacy. What can the international community do? And we're particularly looking at the issues relating to Russia and Ukraine. And with that, I'll hand over to Charles to speak first.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to talk mainly about the EU's response to events in Ukraine, but I will say a little bit first about Russia and Ukraine, though I think later speakers will go into more detail on what's actually happening there. The first point I'd make about Russia is we in the West should be very humble about our analysis, because we keep on getting it wrong. I don't think many of us predicted the invasion of 2008 when they went into Georgia. And certainly when Medvedev was president and Putin was prime minister, a lot of Western governments, notably Germany and the United States, really believed that Medvedev could be the man of the future. He could push aside Putin. That turned out to be rather naive, but that's what people thought. Even this autumn, or rather last autumn, I don't think many of us expected Russia to get so angry about the EU's Eastern Partnership that would put very heavy pressure on Moldova and Ukraine and Armenia and others to abandon it by closing borders to their products and so on. I don't think people in the West understood how much Putin cared about the customs union which he's building into a Eurasian economic community. I don't think many of us predicted what Putin did by seizing Crimea, and very few of us then thought that he would go on creating more trouble in eastern Ukraine. So we should be very, very humble in whatever we predict. My guess is that Russia's objective wasn't to seize Crimea per se, it was to stop Ukraine becoming a Western country that could one day join the EU, possibly NATO, and generally be strategically hostile to Russia. That means for Russia keeping it a weak and chaotic country. It means destabilising the east of the country and preventing credible elections on May 25th. I assume that Putin doesn't plan to invade the east of Ukraine. He'd rather keep it as a Transnistria type body, something that is technically part of another country but in practice controlled by him, Donbass as Transnistria. But it's possible if the violence gets out of control, he may intervene militarily simply to create order. Now, it seems within Russia, Putin has solved one problem and created another. The problem he solved is that his government was declining in support until recent events. He's extremely popular now, including with quite educated middle-class people. It's not just less educated people. And with hindsight, there's always been this side to Russia, and I'm sure Bobo will talk about it more. the Slavophile, anti-Western, paranoid side of Russia. In the 90s, I spent time in Bosnia, and during the Bosnia War, of course, the Russians refused to acknowledge that the Serbs could do the dreadful things they did in Bosnia because they were brothers of the Russians, therefore they couldn't, and Russians never agreed that Srebrenica ever happened. So with hindsight, we shouldn't be perhaps so surprised. Now we see the Russian foreign policy regime in the grip of a kind of anti-Western paranoia, as seems to be the case. And I think going along with this new line on foreign policy is obviously more repression. I think politically, Russia is more repressive today than it's been at any time since the collapse of the USSR. The problem he's created for himself is the economy. The economy was in a hell of a mess before the Ukraine crisis began. It had stopped growing. There was very little investment from foreigners or Russians, one reason being the lack of rule of law. And what the sanctions have done, although they may not look very scary to the Russians, is they've changed the economic climate in Moscow. So there's even less investment than there was before, and it's taken economic confidence out of the Russian system. Today, big Russian companies cannot raise international credits. It's simply they cannot do that anymore, and they could do that 3 months ago. So I think, although the reserves that Russia has will be a cushion for economic problems, in the long run, the Russian economy has an extraordinarily gloomy outlook, and quite how that affects the politics, I've no idea. But we must consider the possibility that the political system will become nastier and the foreign policy will become nastier because they can blame foreigners for what's going wrong. A word on Ukraine itself, and again, I don't claim to be as expert on Ukraine as other people here, but I would make a couple of comments, partly based on a conversation I had yesterday with somebody who just come from East Ukraine. I think that the government in Kiev is rather less admirable than is perhaps portrayed in the Western media. I mean, I happen to think Yatsenyuk is a nice, decent chap. I've met him a few times. But if you look at the opinion polls in Ukraine now, the parties represented in Yatsenyuk's government add up to about 20% in the opinion polls. Most Ukrainians don't think much of the government, not just those in the east, as far as I can see. They made a big mistake in not putting any significant figure from East Ukraine into the government or the party of the regions. Why do they not give a job to somebody like Konstantin Grishenko, the former foreign minister, a very competent figure who worked for Yanukovych? People like him were not given jobs. Some of those given jobs were second-rate people. So they made a lot of mistakes. And I think we probably can't blame Russia for everything that's happening in the east. Again, I don't know what's happening there, but I gather that some of those thugs doing nasty things are basically paid by Yanukovych and his family. The Russians are doing nasty things as well, but a lot of people, I think, probably are not paid to do nasty things. They're actually supporting the insurgency because they agree with this insurgency, because for them the government in Kiev has no legitimacy. In the long run, Ukraine cannot be stable economically or politically unless Russia accepts some sort of deal, some sort of bargain concerning Ukraine. We have a problem here in the short term and the long term. In the short term, we in the West don't want to countenance that because Russia's behaviour is so inexcusable, and the Russians aren't really on for it either because they don't accept they can even talk to the government in Kiev. So there's a problem with the short term and the long term. In the long term, we have to have some sort of deal involving Russia, the West and Ukraine. It's pretty obvious what sort of deal it would be. There'd be some sort of decentralisation within Ukraine, language rights for Russians, perhaps specific provisions for the bits of the military-industrial complex that are important to Russia, economic aid from Russia, the EU, the US, and international institutions. And Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, and possibly the promise of some sort of DCFTA for Russia's customs union, possibly. Enough on Ukraine and Russia. Let me now just finish with some remarks on the EU itself. The first one is a very general one. I'm just astonished how successful Russian propaganda has been in getting elites and intelligentsia in Western European countries to see the Russian point of view. I'm not going to name names, but I recently talked to a Labour member of the House of Lords, a very well-known figure, who basically said it's all the EU's fault because we never should have enlarged NATO. I talked to one very well-known public intellectual who's a good friend of mine, who basically also repeated it was the EU's fault because half of Ukraine is really part of Russia anyway and should have always been part of Russia. When I was in the Chancellery in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, somebody very senior said to me, it's really, what's happening in Ukraine is largely, or at least partly the EU's fault, because the DCFTA with Ukraine would have damaged Russia's industrial base. And the EU should have made much more effort to consult the Russians about its plans, signed with the DCFTA, the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement that caused all the furore, part of the Eastern Partnership. And he said the EU should have consulted Russia more on those last 2 points. That's factually incorrect, and he should know as a senior person in the Chancellery that the way the DCFTA works, if Ukraine does come into it, it's now will probably happen, it doesn't restrict or impede any trade between Russia and Ukraine. And as for the EU not consulting, the EU put this Eastern Partnership, the DCFTA, on the agenda of successive EU-Russia summits. The Russians didn't want to talk about it, they weren't interested. And only in the spring of last year, suddenly the Russians woke up to the fact that if Ukraine joins the Eastern Partnership, it cannot join Russia's, Putin's pet project of the customs union. So that's when the Russians decided to put the boot in. So the Russians are very, very good at propagandizing Western elite. It's not just Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen who sympathise with the Russian point of view. It's not just them. It's a lot of quite mainstream, well-informed senior people. The obvious point is if the EU wants to have some influence on events in Ukraine and Russia, it's got to stand together and be united. The news here is not entirely bad. Compared with 5 years ago, the European states have come together to some degree. 5 years ago, you had Cyprus off in one extreme, which was basically did whatever the Russians told them, and you had Poland and the Balts on the other extreme, who really were very antagonistic to the Russians. And they have come together to some degree. The Cypriots actually are a little bit less completely in Russia's pocket than they were. The spectrum has narrowed, but the middle ground is still not very critical of Russia, because so many countries have important national reasons why they just don't want to be tough on Russia. For the southern Europeans, they never think that human rights matters in foreign policy. They really don't. The Italians, the Spanish, the Portuguese and the Greeks and the Cypriots. Some of them are culturally close to Russia, like Greece and Cyprus. Some of them, of course, get their gas from Russia, like Bulgaria. But some of the countries that get their gas from Russia, like the Baltics and Poland, are nevertheless very tough on Russia. Some of them, it's just the economic links with Russia, and that obviously is the case with Germany, which has massive economic links with Russia, importing gas, exporting cars and machinery, more than 20 billion euros of investments in Russia. So it's still quite hard to get the Europeans together. Just a brief word on Britain, since we're standing in Britain. The British policy on Russia has been kind of all over the place in the last few years. At the time of the Litvinenko affair, so 2006, was that roughly? Yep. The British policy, perhaps understandably, got very tough. They cut off intelligence cooperation and visa restrictions of Russian officials and so on. Then Cameron and William Hague engineered a kind of rapprochement over recent years. They had quite nice meetings with them, lots of talk about economic cooperation. And so when the Ukraine crisis began, the British government didn't know what to do. It didn't really have a policy on Ukraine, which is why it wasn't part of the Weimar Triangle of Germany, France and Poland that took the lead for the EU when this happened. And I remember talking to a Foreign Office official, I think January this year, Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, came to town to talk about Ukraine, and the official said to me, "We've got Tusk in town tomorrow. We don't have a policy on Ukraine. Help, what should we say?" Shocking, really. But they got better, and in the last few years, the British government has developed a policy on Ukraine, and within the 2 emergency meetings of the European Council that there have been, Cameron has been one of the people asking for a tougher, more effective response, and prepared to be tougher than probably than the French and the Germans at least, not tougher than everybody. So rather late, the British have got into the game. France is not particularly engaged either. In 2008, do you remember Sarkozy solved the Georgia War? He flew to Moscow. France did have the presidency of the EU at the time. He did broker a kind of compromise between Russia and everybody else that sort of worked, and at least got the fighting to stop. It was all very glory, of course, but it was quite effective. This time, France is fighting 2 wars in Africa at the moment, as we speak. Plus, Hollande is just not somebody who has a kind of feel for foreign policy and doesn't want to be active in the way that Sarkozy was. So what does this mean? It means that the Germans are in charge of the EU's policy on Russia. At least they have the potential to really lead the EU. But as some of the people I've met recently in Berlin say, they realise they cannot lead unless they are fairly close to the middle of the spectrum on where the EU stands on Russia. And they have been, as I said, very much on the soft end of the spectrum. German policy has evolved in the last few years, from being very soft to rather less soft, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. The Pussy Riot incidents, the Magnitsky affair, motions passed in the Bundestag criticising Russia have led to quite a lot of tension, despite the economic links and the businessmen saying, no, let's go soft. And I think at the moment Merkel, at least with her rhetoric on Russia, has really been very tough indeed, is trying to lead Germany towards the middle. The foreign ministry is trying to put the brake down, controlled by Steinmeier, a soft socialist. And there is tension there, and you have a lot of forces in Germany trying to prevent Russia getting tough on Russia. You have the industrial lobbies in the Ostausschuss, you have the SPD itself, you have public opinion which doesn't want any sanctions on Russia, at least many Germans do not. So I don't know where Germany's going to end up on this. There's a big debate going on there as we speak. The whole crisis has been very difficult for Germany, because Germany likes to believe in a postmodern world. It believes you can solve most problems through negotiation, and have these wonderful phrases. I don't speak German, but Wandel durch Handel, changing people through trading with them. Wandel durch Annäherung, changing people through getting close to people and having a rapprochement with them. And they're realizing that for many years they've been saying we must have modernization partnerships with Russia. For many years the Germans have believed the more you talk to the Russians, the nicer they'll become, the more Western they'll become. And they're just beginning to realize this is all bullshit. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. And this is a sort of cold shower for the German foreign policy establishment. And they're in a bit of a crisis at the moment. Just to finish, I'm going to stop in a second. What should the EU do? Well, the EU's got, obviously, from what I've said, I think the EU's got to be tougher than it has been. Very hard to be tough, of course, for obvious reasons, that we will lose much more economically than the Americans will. I think the Russians, who are super realist, understand balance of forces more than they understand postmodernism in foreign policy. And that means that we need, in terms of force, we do need to reinforce NATO members with forces. This is beginning to happen a bit. I've been in the Baltics recently. They're very worried. They have Russian-speaking minorities. The Putin doctrine, which is we can intervene to protect Russian speakers wherever we want, whenever we want, could apply to Latvia and Estonia. So I think we need to send troops to those countries to make them feel secure, but very difficult to defend them. Actually, militarily, almost impossible to defend them, but psychologically we should send troops. Same for Poland. We shouldn't do that for Ukraine because it's not in NATO, but I don't see why we shouldn't give other sorts of military aid and advice to the Ukrainians. But the real deterrent has to be economic. The EU under Merkel's leadership has developed a phase 3 approach to sanctions. We've had phases 1 and 2, which aren't very scary. Phase 3, well, we don't know what is phase 3. They haven't told us. They're talking about it. There are conversations going on between the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians on phase 3. I think it means the French don't sell the Mistral helicopter carriers, the British start closing the City of London, and the Germans do something to limit energy relations. That's what it probably is going to mean, but we haven't said what it means. And if we don't say what it's going to mean, then it's not much of a deterrent. The Russians think it's a paper tiger. So actually we need to sort of, have a leak to the Financial Times, secret document, EU's phase 3 of sanctions. Then it might make the Russians think again. And perhaps we should say phase 3 comes in unless the Russians remove all their forces from Ukraine. I think we should do that. Also, the energy security. I mean, that's something the EU, to its credit, is doing. The British have taken the lead. This has been there are papers now coming up for discussion this summer on energy security. Building interconnections between different European countries. There is money in the EU budget for it. There's money in the EIB for it. It is happening. It's happened already a bit. It's going to happen. They're going to speed up now. Energy efficiency, new pipelines like the TAP pipeline taking Azerbaijani gas to Italy. I would be in favour of carbon capture and storage on coal, more liquefied natural gas, shale gas, and I'm in favour of nuclear, not everybody is. But there's a lot that the EU can do to reduce its energy dependency on Russia. And it can actually say to the Russians, we will plan to reduce our energy dependency on you by a certain percentage each year for the next few years. It'll take a long time. It can't happen rapidly. But that would make the Russians, that would give them pause for thought. My last comment is what all this means for the global order. Well, I think the West's very bad relationship with with Russia is here to stay for a long time. I mean, the sanctions have been put on because of its annexation of Ukraine, technically, so they're not going to annex Ukraine. So I think they're here for a long time. We're going to have to get used to a much more conflictual relationship with Russia. I assume that Russia will be very difficult on other issues like Iran and Syria, though hopefully if the Iranians really want to do a deal with the West, which is at least possible, the Russians can't really stop them. I don't know how much damage the Russians can do, but also in terms of future conflicts with China, I don't see Russia doing the West any favours in terms of what they do in the UN Security Council. And this may give China the feeling it has more freedom of manoeuvre. If it has a kind of guaranteed ally in any conflict between China and the West, in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, Chinese just may feel a little bit more secure. They're not on their own if they start behaving a little bit in the Putin-esque way and just trying to create facts on the ground and not worrying too much about international law and international rules. It may give, Russian behaviour may give China an excuse to behave rather badly. At any rate, we're seeing a shift away from the global governance that many of us like to see, if you like, the postmodern international order. And I think the UN Security Council will be weak and disabled for many years. So I finish on a rather gloomy note. Thank you. Excellent.
Thanks very much. That's right, and this all puts Japan in a slightly difficult position, I think, but let's hear it from Professor Hyodo.
So my name is Shinji Hyodo from National Institute for Defense Studies, and first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and Daiwa Foundation, Anglo-Japanese Foundation, to invite me here, and also all the participants to be here. And the National Institute for Defense Studies is a Japanese policy think tank of Ministry of Defense, but today's my presentation is complete my individual analysis opinion, and those do not reflect any official stance of the Japanese government. And today's title of my presentation is Changes of the East Asian Strategic Environment and Japan-Russia Relations. So please look at the pictures, and so last Sochi meeting and the fifth meeting between the President Putin and Prime Minister Abe. And right up at pictures shows that so this dog and governors and Akita Prefecture, which locates in the northern parts, gave Putin Japanese dog. And when Prime Minister met Putin in Sochi, so Putin shows the given dog to our Prime Minister. And also the left side down picture, it shows that close individual relation between them, and they call each other by first name and Vladimir and Shinzo. And right down picture shows that Japanese player proceeded that map of the Japan was shown on the ground, and this is northern part of the Japan, and there are so many clouds over the map, so we cannot understand that which side the northern territory belong to. I think this is the Russian way of consideration to Japan. And April last year, the first official visit of Japan's Prime Minister to Russia in 10 years. And it was agreed to convene 2+2 meeting between the Japanese and the Russian foreign and the defense ministers for high-level strategic consultations concerned with a broad range of security questions. The new opening in relations linked to the bilateral security was the biggest achievement of the summit. So having since 1960 conducted a similar meeting with its ally, the United States, and from 2007 with Australia, so which calls Japan its closest partner in Asia. So Japan has added Russia as third on this list. For Russian side, Japan is the fifth to make the 2+2 list after the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy, and a fast partner of this sort in Asia. So regarding each other as strategic partners means that the two have greatly raised the strategic level of their relations, and this gives the impression to the third countries that as the two countries are staring at China's rise as a great power, they are rushing to draw closer together. And it is said that the politically Japanese-Russian relations sank to their worst level since the end of the Cold War through the visit to Kunashiri. It's one of the biggest islands of the Northern Territories of then President Medvedev in 2010. So at that time, and who could predict the 2+2 meeting between Russia and Japan? And from September 2011, after Prime Minister Putin declared his candidacy for the president, while leaving aside the specifics for resolving the Northern Territories issue, Russia repeatedly has sought security cooperation with Japan. So as its strategic interests have been shifting from Europe to Asia, in order to develop advantageous strategic cooperative relations with China, with which Russia has lost all parity, Russia must strengthen strategic links to Japan, Vietnam, and India, South Korea, all of which have put distance between themselves and China. The Chinese authorities, for their part, have urged the Russians to present a united front against Japan, as both countries have outstanding disputes with Japan. In the case of China, over the Senkaku Island issues, and in the case of Russia, over the South Korea Islands, what we call Northern Territories, Hokpo Ryodo in Japanese, by Japan. The Russians, however, have ignored the China's proposal, overtures, and are maintaining the neutral stance regarding the Sino-Japanese relations. So Russo-Chinese relations have been linked to the marriage of convenience, and no outright divorce is expected for the foreseeable future. So Dr. Bobo Lo is a specialist on this theme. And the relationship is not likely to develop into the military alliance, but neither is a definitely antagonistic relationship foreseen. However, in view of the constantly growing gap in economic and military power between the two countries, if Russia is not to end up playing the role of a junior partner to China, reversing its previous role as China's big brother, so it will need to seek ways of maintaining the bilateral balance of power through the diplomatic channels by forging stronger strategic partnership with the third countries, including Japan. So this is the map of the Northern Territories. And a gap has opened between the China and Russia in the degree to which they are motivated politically to contain Japan and the United States. So according to the persons close to the Russian government, the Chinese side has appealed many times to launch the joint struggle over the Senkaku and the Northern Territories islands. But as I said, that Russia has not responded, and hereafter will maintain its neutrality in the Sino-Japanese relations. So next is about the joint military exercise between China and Russia. So joint military exercises between China and Russia under the rubric of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization have continued since 2003. One phase of this is a plan for the two states to stand together in order to contain United States and Japan. In fact, in the newly launched joint naval exercises from 2012, coordination between China and Russia, ran into difficulty from the outset in the regard to the nature and the place of location of these exercises. One could perceive a difference of degree between China and Russia in the political stance on containing Japan. So against this background, one can summarize the reason for starting the 2+2 dialogue, and for the Russian side's determination to advance Russo-Japanese strategic cooperation. And about 20 Russian-Chinese ships combined and participated in this maritime exercise, but when compared to the 10,000 person large-scale joint military exercise of 2005, the scope of these exercises was limited. And in the past, Sino-Russian military collaboration took the form of outward-looking exercise to send the message to the third countries. But the maritime collaboration that began in 2012 transformed the exercises into an inward-looking process to grasp the maritime capability of the partner country. So it is thought that the objective through various exercises is direct confirmation for Russia of the capacity of the Chinese Navy in the midst of striking maritime advances, while for China of Russia's advanced anti-submarine warfare capacity. So given these more limited objectives, neither side needs large-scale joint exercises with the participation of the broad swath of the military. And with aim of achieving still further military reform, Defense Minister Shoigu ordered the first snap inspection of the military units, capabilities, and readiness to be implemented across the whole of Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The unannounced inspections were conducted in last July, principally in the Russian Far East, on a scale that was the largest since the breakup of the Soviet Union. They involved participation at 17 exercise areas and of roughly 160,000 troops and over 5,000 tanks and more than 130 aircraft. So while this was going on, so 5 military vessels of the Chinese Navy passed into the Sea of Okhotsk through the La Perouse Strait, also known as Soya Strait in Japanese. Okay, here, Soya Strait. So 5 Chinese military vessels passed through into the Sea of Okhotsk at that time, and President Putin ordered the Minister of Defense Shoigu to conduct ad hoc military inspections. So as a result of this timing, some observers, including me, speculated that the snap inspections were aimed at preparing the Russian military to discourage incursion into the Arctic Ocean and the surrounding northern seas by the Chinese Navy. So this is the map of the Chinese advancement to the Arctic. So Chinese and icebreaker Snow Dragon. So what a big name it is, Snow Dragon. This is so icebreaker, which China introduced from Ukraine, and conducted investigation in the Arctic around 5 times. And this is the sailing route. They departed from Qingdao and passed through the Sea of Japan. And after that, they passed through the Soya Strait and went into the Sea of Okhotsk, and the final destination, Iceland, Reykjavik. So moves have been observed to strengthen the country's military presence in that region through the creation of new specialized the Arctic military forces and the expansion of the Air Force network of bases in the Russian Arctic. And this is believed to stem from the authorities' perception that strategic risk posed in the Russian Arctic are growing. The Russians have begun to view the Arctic and the Russian Far East as a single, strategically unified military theater, and as a result are strengthening their naval and the border security forces in both regions, the Arctic and Russian Far East. And the Russian military objects to the idea of the Sea of Okhotsk being used as a shortcut to the Arctic Ocean by Chinese ship. So this is the gateway to the Arctic from China. And believed to be hoping to the increased cooperation with Japan with regard to both the Arctic and the Sea of Okhotsk. So so December we conducted the first meeting of the 2+2 dialogue, and one of the agenda is maritime cooperation in the Arctic and the Sea of Okhotsk. So Russia has been placing greater importance on the cooperation with Japan in the security fields as a means of maintaining balance in its diplomatic relation with China. And following an official visit to Russia by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the first such visit in 10 years, so agreement was reached to hold a 2+2 dialogue. This meeting signified that Russia and Japan had begun to view one another as an important strategic partner and raised the strategic importance of the bilateral relationship to the next level. And last December, newly established Japanese National Security Council made the first edition of the National Security Strategy. And what does it say about Russia? I read the text. So under the increasingly severe security environment in East Asia, it is critical for Japan to advance cooperation with Russia in all areas, including security and energy. Security is the first, energy is the second. That is the point. Thereby enhancing bilateral relations as a whole in order to ensure its security. Based on this recognition, Japan will cooperate with Russia in securing peace and stability of the Asia-Pacific regions. So this is our official stance about our relation with neighboring Russia. But however, so after Ukraine crisis and annexation of Crimea, and frankly speaking, Japan face difficulties. And one hand, we must enhance our security cooperation with Russia. And the other hand, we're sharing the views with G7 countries to impose additional sanctions on Russia. And in the sense that Prime Minister Abe make the European trip, including UK, and he will visit tomorrow here in London and meet your Prime Minister Cameron and exchange the views about Crimea Ukraine crisis. And I think that Japan should and must modify our basic stance towards Russia, the basic approach towards Russia. So this is the map made my analysis and Russia's sphere of influence. So Russia's sphere of influence consists of the two parts. It's land sphere of influence. It's a former Soviet Union, excluding three Baltic states. And the Ukraine is it's a very so big position in the land sphere of influence. And the other one is a sea, on the sea sphere of influence, and the Arctic and the Russian Far East, including the Sea of Okhotsk. So I think that I so often exchange view with our counterpart and the Russian and the forces, and we have regular contact, and we discussed about Russia's recognition about the sphere of influence, and their basic stance is that Russia does not want foreign countries to come in to the sphere of influence. So Ukraine case, of course, is a NATO EU expansion into the land sphere of influence. And another is the Chinese expansion to the Arctic through the Sea of Okhotsk. So in the sense that Russia is repeatedly demanded Japan to enhance the maritime security cooperation, especially in the Arctic and Russian Far East. The final point is that Ukraine and China. Some specialists in Russia mentioned that currently Ukraine and China enhance the cooperation in the economy, and not only on the economic field but also the security field. So Ukraine sells Russian arms to China, and left side picture is a Chinese aircraft carrier, and right side is a Zulu class air cushion landing craft. So this was made in Crimea Peninsula. So some observer says that this type of Zulu class, air cushioned landing craft might be used for Taiwan or Senkaku. Okay, it is time to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Well, good evening. No, thanks very much. I'm going to try and pick up a few points that Charles has made, and also Shinji as well. Really, my presentation is a kind of 2-for-1. I'm going to look at why Ukraine matters to Russia, what Russia is trying to do in Ukraine, where things might develop, albeit I acknowledge the very great dangers of predicting anything in the current circumstances. In the second half, I will also look at the Russia-China relationship, the Ukraine factor. What does it mean? Does it fundamentally change things in Russia-China relationship, and actually Russia-Japan as well, and Russia's approach to the Asia-Pacific region? So first question is, why does Ukraine matter so much to Putin, and actually to the Russian political elite? And I think there are a number of key dimensions. The first dimension, historical, civilizational. Essentially, Ukraine occupies a central place in Russian conceptions of identity. For Putin and for many Russians, the notion of an independent and separate Ukraine from Russia has no meaning, because there's a shared identity, a shared history since the founding of the Kievan Rus in the 10th century. So this goes back more than 1,000 years. So you may have heard that Putin described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now for Putin, the most unnatural, the most catastrophic part of that geopolitical catastrophe is the separation, is the severing of the umbilical cord between Russia and Ukraine. Second dimension, the strategic dimension. Ukraine as you all have seen, not on this map, but no doubt on other maps, occupies a pivotal geographical location. Essentially, viewed from Moscow, whoever occupies Ukraine or controls Ukraine dominates Eastern Europe and exerts a larger influence throughout much of the rest of Europe and indeed across Eurasia. So Putin, it's not surprising, given its strategic importance, that Putin sees Ukrainian membership participation in his Eurasian Union project as absolutely critical to its success. Third dimension, a related one, security dimension. Control or influence over Ukraine is integral to Russian understandings of security. In other words, the Kremlin sees Ukraine not only just in terms of projecting power and influence, but also through a more existential and defensive security prism. Fourth dimension, what you'd call the domestic political dimension. Putin is concerned about the contagion effect of grassroots democratic movements. Now, this was apparent 10 years ago at the time of the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. But it has since been accentuated by developments in the Arab Spring, by the anti-Putin protests in 2011-12, and by the drastic slowdown of the Russian economy that Charles mentioned. And it's really important here, however, not to exaggerate the influence of this dimension. I saw an interesting interview with David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, and he was arguing essentially that the slowdown in the Russian economy was creating a mindset in the Kremlin that it needed a short, victorious war. I think that's a gross distortion of the point. Next dimension, the economic dimension. Ukraine is Russia's third largest trading partner. But more important than that is that the respective business elites in Ukraine and Russia are bound very tightly together. And they have extremely important ties in areas such as the military-industrial complex that Shinji has already referred to. And finally, we tend to think sometimes Putin is this sort of inexorable calculating machine, you know, the cynical Machiavellian type, again, running rings around hapless Western politicians. In fact, he's quite an emotional being. And it should be, you can never underestimate how important the male ego is, and especially in something like this. Because the overthrow of the Yanukovych regime and its replacement by an administration far more sympathetic towards Europe and towards the West arguably represented the worst personal setback Putin had suffered since he first entered the Kremlin in January 2000. It was an intense personal humiliation. Moreover, one can make a case that it was Russia's worst foreign policy setback of the entire post-Soviet period. Worse and more humiliating still than NATO enlargement or missile defense or even the NATO intervention over Kosovo. Putin personally invested so much in the relationship with Ukraine that any setback or conversely triumph was and is and will be directly personalized. So second question, what are Putin's objectives? Very difficult, because these objectives are rather fluid, really difficult to nail down. Now, but I was thinking about how to approach this, and I thought perhaps we could look at it in terms of three plans, A, B, and C. Now, I don't want to give the impression that it's all, you know, brilliantly and strategically conceived, because it's not. What I think these plans reveal is a kind of mix of mystical vision, geopolitical instincts, geopolitical anxieties, gut instincts, and tactical improvisation. But together, they underscore that Ukraine is the #1 foreign policy priority for Putin, and its importance is essentially timeless and inalienable. So what are these plans? Plan A, what I call postmodern imperialism. I agree with Charles in that I think Putin's intentions until pretty recently were to respect the division of the Soviet Union into 15 formally independent and sovereign republics. Because although he viewed the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as a disaster, as an aberration, he did not try to reconstitute it. In fact, he strongly resisted pressure to reintegrate Crimea into the Russian Federation. So you have a pretty good record, that is, until very recently. But, on the other hand, at no stage has he regarded the ex-Soviet republics as fully sovereign. He has always acted on the assumption that Russia has a primary right of influence in their decision-making, particularly in foreign and security policy. And this understanding kind of resembles the former Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev's idea of limited sovereignty in relation to the Warsaw Pact countries. Another way, I think, to describe this general approach is indirect imperialism or imperialism by proxy. I think we should emphasize that Russia's approach, its management of relations with the former Soviet republics, is more calculating than messianic. There's not really an evangelical sense of purpose. Rather, there's a kind of prosaic evaluation of costs and benefits of regional leadership, and critically, what Putin thinks is achievable. Now, as long as Yanukovych appeared to be in control and amenable to Kremlin influence, Moscow, Putin, was prepared to work through him. Actually, Putin thought Yanukovych was a bum. He thought he was an idiot, a schmuck, whatever. But he thought, what's the alternative? So he thought, look, bad though he is, he's the best there is. Actually, he has a similar dislike for Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. But again, what's the alternative? Kremlin didn't see any alternative. But of course, that's changed. So once Yanukovych was overthrown, Plan A went out the window. So we then moved to Plan B. And I would argue that Plan B is what we have today, more or less. And I call it indirect rule. Before we get on to Plan B, we should ask, what does Putin ultimately want for Ukraine? Well, I think he hopes for a Ukraine that is sufficiently dysfunctional, sufficiently hopeless, to be subject, to be very, very vulnerable to Russian influence and interests. But on the other hand, he doesn't want Ukraine to be so unstable that it's a constant drain on Russian resources. And what does this mean in practical terms? Well, first, concrete steps. It means a delegitimization of the current transitional administration in Kiev. It means the delegitimization of the forthcoming presidential elections on 25th May. It means the emergence of a cooperative, or at least intimidated, compliant leadership in Kiev. Putin has actually incidentally said that he'd quite like to work with Yulia Tymoshenko because he thinks he can do deals with her. It means the so-called federalization of Ukraine. Now, whereby essentially the country's eastern regions, so we're looking at Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, particularly those areas, and of course Crimea, in effect secede from the rest of the country, secede from Ukraine. It means a rapid consolidation and expansion of Russian control in these regions. And the comparison here is with Abkhazia and South Ossetia pre-2008 and with Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova. And how you do it through proxies. local politicians, armed thugs. You use the resources that are there. Finally, this approach of indirect rule, Plan B, means the emasculation of the rest of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian rump state. It means the formal assurance of so-called neutrality. Not only Ukraine's non-membership of NATO or the EU, but also its non-participation in any association agreement or even trade deals or trade agreements with Europe. Now, the whole point of Plan B, indirect rule, is to maximize Russian influence, but at minimum cost. It gives the veneer, the surface, the appearance of due process, rule of law, and international endorsement, or at least acquiescence. The West would remain indecisive, divided, and compliant, and sanctions against Russia would be utterly ineffectual. So Plan C, what is Plan C? Well, I call Plan C partial occupation, because I think there is tacit recognition in Moscow that some sort of Russian military action is essentially unavoidable. It's going to happen sooner or later, given, frankly, the rather optimistic scenario underpinning Plan B. Now, there are several plausible paths, but all these arise out of a steady escalation of violence. Let me paint you a scenario. You have seizures of Ukrainian government buildings and facilities. This is already happening. You have armed skirmishes. That's already happening. You have abduction and intimidation of outsiders, OSCE observers, Western journalists, tick. You have some bloodshed. It's already happening too. Then you have, and this is yet to happen in earnest, low-level Russian intervention to quote-unquote protect the local ethnic Russian populations. This then leads to a growing number of incidents with Ukrainian forces. This kicks on to larger scale Russian intervention and potentially the introduction of so-called Russian peacekeepers. Now, there are several occupation scenarios. The first involves Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, where there's a majority ethnic Russian population. These are these two areas here, Luhansk here, Donetsk there. Heavily industrial regions. The second scenario, however, brings in the major cities of Kharkiv, up here, and Dnipropetrovsk, over here. And the key thing about Kharkiv, number 2 city, I think Dnipropetrovsk, I could be wrong, is number 3. But they are centers of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, which is very, very closely related to Russia's own. So there's a sense that Luhansk and Donetsk by itself is not enough. You go to option B, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, you take all this area. Then, third variant, take the whole Black Sea coastline. So right now you've got Donetsk here. You've got the Russians already annexing Crimea over here. The problem, however, is Crimea is not a self-sustaining entity. It gets its facilities, utilities, stuff from Kherson. Then you also have the Russian-controlled or breakaway republic of Transnistria, just here, the right side of Moldova. It's not properly marked here, but Tiraspol here is the capital. And you have the iconic city of Odessa here. So what could easily happen is to kind of complete the circle, so to speak. You're already in Donetsk, you take Zaporozhye, you expand into Kherson, take Mykolaiv, Odessa, and Chisinau. It looks unrealistic, but actually I think it could be done, and there's an awful lot of chatter about this possibility right now. Fourth variant, you go right to the Dnieper River. So Dnieper River is essentially going down here like so, and you go to up to, and you could include Kiev. So essentially you have a partition of Ukraine, Russian East, Western or European West, and this would bear some sort of historical similarities to the kind of partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, in which the Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great played a dominant role. So more things change, the more they stay the same, perhaps. So, what is actually going to happen? Now, as I mentioned, Putin's approach in the past, present, and I think in the future is frankly more improvisational than strategic. And what I mean by strategic, it's conceptually well thought out. It isn't that. So it's very much, he's playing it a little bit by ear, just probing, see what happens. Now, ideally, he would like to reach a deal with Washington and Brussels, but frankly, I don't think he believes he can. I think he thinks the chances of that happening are getting lower all the time. Time is an issue. For many in the Russian elite, it makes sense to move quickly, because while the Americans and especially the Europeans are continuing to dither, hesitate, geez, maybe we should engage with the Russians, be nice to them, all that sort of stuff, there is a kind of window of opportunity. And many, I think, in the Russian political class believe you need to seize that opportunity while it's still there. You create facts on the ground to essentially force the West and Kiev to reach a deal on Russian terms. Now, I believe that Putin's response, Putin's approach will be heavily contingent, heavily influenced by the way the West responds or does not respond. I think the Europeans are crucial here, because continuing vacillation and half-heartedness, yet without the serious prospect of a negotiated settlement, will encourage him to be bold. He'll think, geez, I'm doing pretty well, I might just keep rolling here. Conversely, a vigorous Western response involving tougher sanctions, a beefing up of NATO's force presence in places like in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, as Charles mentioned, I think would demonstrate that the West is serious about defending Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, of course, this could, in theory, provoke the Kremlin into behaving even more aggressively. But frankly, I think we're past that point. I think it's much more likely to have a deterrent effect. It raises the cost of Russian aggression to levels that will be deemed too risky by the Kremlin. I think it's worth recalling the adage that the longer you delay a decisive policy response, the greater the eventual cost will be. Now, I think we saw that in the lead up to the Second World War, but I think also we saw it in the 1990s in relation to Slobodan Milosevic and the Balkans. I think in the current climate, the Kremlin is likely to see Western calls for understanding, engagement, dialogue as a kind of appeasement born of weakness, decadence, and fear. I get this from Russian journalists. They say, yeah, you think you can scare us with those kind of sanctions? They're a joke. I think it's worth mentioning, since we're talking about the nature of power a little bit here, that Joseph Nye, in a way the father of the concept of soft power, has argued consistently that there is no effective soft power without hard power to back it up in case of need. And I think this is especially true in the case of Ukraine. The West, I believe, must be careful not just to make a deal just for deal's sake, or to seek accommodation for its own sake. Because what we need to remember here is that nothing less than the long-term security, long-term future of European security is at stake. Just very quickly, on China's objectives and interests in the Ukraine crisis. Beijing has adopted a very soft, almost invisible line towards developments in Ukraine. Now, there was initially, it's true, some unhappiness at Moscow's flouting of China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, in particular that mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other hand, Beijing also deplored the overthrow of Yanukovych by a grassroots democratic movement led, it thinks, and supported by the West. Now, what's actually happened in Chinese policy towards Ukraine is that these opposing normative concerns have effectively cancelled each other out. China's overriding objective in this whole crisis is to avoid collateral damage from any sharp deterioration in Russia-West relations. It sees a neutral, disengaged stance as offering the best prospects for achieving this goal. And it's very much a case that it thinks less is more. It's not only safer, but it also reflects a belief that actually, China doesn't have to do very much just for all the geopolitical and economic benefits to come flowing towards it. So what's happened is that Beijing has done very little other than issuing pro forma calls for moderation and political solutions. And we saw this. Its passive stance was highlighted in the votes in the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. It abstained because it understood that, of course, it couldn't support the Russians because it would have exposed its so-called defensive principles as a complete hypocrisy. On the other hand, supporting the Americans and Europeans would have upset the Russians, and it didn't need that. So abstention was the only practical course of action, or rather inaction. Beijing also hopes to achieve several other objectives. Consolidation of the Sino-centric bias in Russia's Asia policy, more generous terms in energy and arms negotiations, support or at least benign neutrality for Chinese objectives in Central Asia, East Asia, South China Sea, the Arctic. The Chinese government, by the way, hopes to maintain a working relationship with Kiev, but of course while minimizing any offense to Moscow. This is not only important for its own sake, but Shinji mentioned the Yanukovych's visit in December 2013.
Yeah.
I mean, I was astonished. I was in Beijing at the time, and I'm thinking, what's he doing here? Shouldn't he be in the Maidan or something? Anyway, but there were 30 billion worth of deals that Yanukovych signed in that December visit. And so the Chinese know that they'll need Russian assistance to implement some of these deals, particularly the ones in Crimea. Implications for Sino-Russian relations, final thing. The extent to which China is successful in meeting its objectives will depend on the breadth, the duration, and the gravity of the Ukraine crisis. Basically, the longer and the more serious the crisis, the better it is for China. Now, the crisis has already undermined efforts to diversify Russia's approach toward aid. Shinji has mentioned the rapprochement with Japan. That was going pretty well. And I still think the rapprochement is not dead, but you also highlighted a real tension coming here, because I believe that the priority of the rapprochement has slipped down the pecking order. Recent developments have pushed Moscow, obviously, to cultivate the Beijing more than ever, especially now that Tokyo basically has to fall in line with G7 sanctions. I would argue that Russia's strategic dependence, we see Putin's brilliant tactical victories, but Russia's strategic dependence on China, I would argue, is at a historic high. China, on the other hand, continues to benefit from considerable strategic flexibility. And the Ukraine crisis has definitely strengthened Chinese positions on more concrete issues. The likelihood of falling European demand for Russian gas, Moscow's need to develop new markets in Asia, suggests that Gazprom will have to come to a deal with the Chinese on the export of gas. They'll have to agree a compromise on Chinese terms, either lower prices or by giving the Chinese a slice of the action. The flow of Russian oil to China is likely to increase. And I would argue that the prospects of serious arms deals involving Su-35 aircraft, Lada-class submarines has increased significantly as a result of developments in Ukraine. Final point. Moscow remains profoundly nervous about Chinese intentions in certain areas, particularly Central Asia, and as Shinji pointed out, the Arctic, most certainly. The trouble is, Russia's capacity to resist Chinese inroads in these areas has been, I would argue, severely compromised. Further afield, Beijing is benefiting from a marked reduction in geopolitical pressure, partly because of the just sheer distraction of the Ukraine crisis, but mainly because Russia, not China, is viewed by the West as international public enemy number one. Meanwhile, Beijing continues to enjoy all the pluses of partnership with Russia: enhanced security, a neo-colonial economic relationship, geopolitical comfort, the reputational dividends of not being Russia, with very few negatives, such as irksome alliance obligations. I'll leave it at that.